Dear friends, one of the hazards of reading the Bible, and especially of interpreting the Bible for others, is insisting that everything in the Bible can be made transparent and clear. Fortunately, there are some stories that are just puzzling, which I'm sure that God includes in Scripture just to ensure that preachers preserve some humility and modesty, which is a long way of saying, I'm not sure how to interpret the story that we have in our Gospel reading this morning. Here we have someone who is a household manager, discovered to be doing a poor job by his boss, who then defrauds that same boss in order to get on in the world, and Jesus commends him. Why? Well, we often try to read allegorical meanings into parables, and in a moment I'm going to mention 3 ways of looking at this text, but let me first rule out one interpretation. Often in parables, the landlord figure is understood to be God, with someone like a worker or a tenant understood to be a stand-in for Israel. But in this case, this is very unlikely to be true. Why? Because it's focused on achievement. Remember an axiom of our faith. Salvation is not a question of achieving some merit by our accomplishment in good works. That is still to be trapped in a mentality that says God's love for us is conditional. And in truth, I can think of nothing more frightening, nothing that is less like good news than to say to someone, you are responsible for your own salvation, and if you can do the right things, then that will mean that you are acceptable. That is the opposite to grace. If you do the right thing, then you'll be acceptable to God. Grace says, you are loved by God. When you finally realize this, then you'll be enabled to do the right thing. It is as grace takes roots in our hearts that inevitably the good works will follow. It is not a matter of achievement. It is a matter of obedience, of being obedient tenants who are prepared to give the landlord his due harvest, in another parable. And so if that harvest is not forthcoming, then it is a sign that there are areas of our lives which are still unredeemed, where God's grace is yet to act. So if not God, how to read this story? Here are 3 suggested ways. First, it might be a political message. The level of Jesus' political engagement through his stories is often underestimated. So in this way of looking at things, the landlord is the Roman Empire, and on this interpretation, Jesus is advocating dishonest dealings with the empire in order to preserve the Jewish nation, look after each other in the face of oppression, things like that. Second, it might be a teaching about money not mattering, as in the summary. You cannot serve both God and mammon. You either structure your life around monetary values, in which case the unjust steward is doing something frightfully wrong, or you say that the money doesn't ultimately matter. Bear in mind that honor is much more important than money in this culture, and it could be that the shrewd steward was restoring the honor of the landlord in the eyes of the public, thereby making restitution for whatever he did wrong in the first place. It might be that he was paid by charging extra on the various loans, and all he is doing is removing his cut from the process. Now that leads to a third possibility, that in this story the shrewd steward is Jesus himself. The analogy goes like this. The sacking is the crucifixion, and the forgiveness of debts is the forgiveness of sins. Most importantly, these good things come from someone who's been rejected by polite society. So 3 different ways to read a parable, and there are likely to be many more. This passage is difficult to read, but the emphasis here is upon what is done by the unjust steward. And what is done? There is forgiveness of debts, and the forgiveness of debts leads to life. In one sense, it doesn't matter why it takes place, but it will change the world. There is always more to discover about the ways of God, and the mysteries of the ways of God in the face of the ways of the world, for the world cannot comprehend the wisdom of God. So take the story away with you today. Sit with it. What do you think it's saying? Amen.